Hey, and welcome back to the second part of some comments on the Telemachiad. That is the first four books of the Odyssey, and Telemachus as a character and other things, including this culture of honor and how Telemachus fits into that. So going back to this culture of honor, we talked about how the book at least draws our attention to the fact that a young man raised by women is in a difficult position inside a warrior culture. We also want to note, however, that there is a sense in which problems that are solved by violence tend to persist. They remain unresolved. Now, anyone who's been a part of a warrior culture for long enough and is as skilled and insightful a commenter as Homer was, or the constellation of different authors that make up of Homer and storytellers, would be able to see that there is something profoundly self-destructive in a culture in which insults to honor result in the death of the flower of the young men of that society. So anytime the rules, the social norms require a blood sacrifice, a killing of a young person in order for honor to be restored, we can say that that is pretty freaking dysfunctional, right? So on the one hand, Telemachus is seen as this kind of, emasculated figure unable to make decisions. But on the other hand, because he stands outside of violence as a mechanism for resolving conflict, he is also another kind of hero, we could say. Perhaps one that is a little closer to our modern sensibilities. Furthermore, we have to talk about the daddy issues, so to speak, because you do have this figure. Odysseus is not depicted as a tyrant father, as an overbearing person who, beats down those who disagree with him. He is instead a persuader, a person whom people are drawn to because they like him. In some sense, this makes him all the more difficult to get over as a kind of a father casting this long shadow that would be very difficult for a son to emerge from. If you just imagine, some muscle-bound idiot shouting at, the Trojans and waving a sword, such a figure, while, he may be a physically impressive specimen, one could say that, a son would improve upon the father who is more intelligent or more likely to use his wits to solve a problem. The problem is Odysseus takes up a lot of room, right? He has a lot of physical strength. He's great. He's quite skilled in particular ways. He's very curious, very obviously intellectually extremely adept, both wise and clever, which is, a tough combination. What do you do if you're Telemachus? Where is the space for you to inhabit? So while the text doesn't quite delve into it, we can sort of start to see these dynamics, especially in the way that Athena and others speak of Odysseus to Telemachus, because all of these great strengths are shown. And yet he's absent, right? So that is a problem. And it's worth mentioning, right, that he was abandoned, that Odysseus went off to fight a war, and it's been almost 2 decades since he's returned when the book begins. And you have, this background, which is the Iliad, of an entire generation of men, as we've said, going to avenge an insult against the honor of the Greeks, which is this the wife of one of the Greek kings being carried off by a Trojan, the famous Helen, whom we'll meet very, very soon. So then you have this deeper concept, right? Which is that there was this age of heroes, the great period of the Bronze Age, the palace culture of the Mycenaeans, which fell and collapsed, and Greece entered the Dark Ages, the Greek Dark Ages, a term which has fallen out of favor of historians, but we're going to use it here anyway, just to keep things, kind of in shorthand. But it's a period in which the population of Greece shrank dramatically. It was clear there was a lot less food around, right? So resources dried up, and there was a lot more kind of violence and a lot of more kind of migration, or homelessness and refugees wandering around. So and there's a very, the historians strongly believe now that one of the reasons that the Mycenaean period ended in collapse, in a kind of whole-scale social collapse, was because the different palace cultures began to fight with one another. Clearly, resources I'm sure were involved, but I suspect that so was honor, right, and glory, and the prominence or social prestige of these individual palaces became at stake, and that probably drove some of the conflict which led to this collapse, right? So you could, it's a bit of a stretch, but not so much. You could read into the discussion of Telemachus a kind of grappling on the part of this culture to come to terms with what it means to have an honor culture, what it might mean to move beyond it into a kind of social period in which there was more emphasis placed on negotiation, diplomacy, that sort of thing, as opposed to just brawn and the glory that such brawn earns you, right? So, Telemachus' secret quest, of his own, where he has to sneak out with the help of Athena. He has to sneak out of his own house, and he kind of hides it from his mother, which is a little weird, but nevertheless the case. Like a little, a boy kind of sneaking out at night. But he goes on a serious diplomatic mission, in part to learn if anyone has had news of his father, but also clearly in part to reestablish his own legitimacy as Prince of Ithaca, and perhaps to reconnect with his father's old war buddies, who are now rich, wealthy kings in their own right, living nearby. Nestor and Menelaus, who has been reunited with his, somewhat frighteningly faithless bride, Helen. So, Telemachus' own quest, and this should draw your attention, is not a quest to cover himself with glory, to end up with a kind of host of stories that will be unbeatable in the annals of storytelling, right? So, in some sense, Odysseus set out and acquired, as we will see, a kind of scabbard or a quiver of stories that were so amazing and so fascinating that they became kind of the ultimate in storytelling itself, right? So Telemachus, is not pursuing stories that legendary, but he is pursuing these kinds of pragmatic goals, these kinds of very particular, directed, pragmatic goals. He's taking risks. There's no doubt that he could, definitely be subjected to violence or even killing by the suitors were they to discover him. And as he enters the foreign lands, even though these kings were friends with his father, it's unclear what will happen when he arrives and what will befall him. Traveling at any time takes risks. But let's be clear, these are more measured, more pragmatic goals, more goals in keeping with our own everyday lives, perhaps you might say. Goals in which we seek out when we're young, older people to help us along our way, to teach us, to give us information, but to support us as we struggle to develop and to establish ourselves. And on a kind of fundamental level, that's what Telemachus is doing. Beyond these specific goals of bringing Ithaca more into contact with these other kingdoms, he is in some sense seeking out these kind of elder male figures very deliberately to support him. Not so much because he's seeking their wisdom, which he seems somewhat skeptical about, but more in a sort of self-interested way, as he is seeking allies to help him on his way, right? So he's presenting himself and saying, will you support me? And he proves himself skilled at this in these first few books. We can see elements of his father in the way that he manages people. Odysseus was widely described as someone who could kind of manage people, and he becomes a sort of de facto leader of the Greeks in Troy, a counselor, but really the eminence grise, the power behind the throne of Agamemnon, as the kind of egos of the Greek leaders spin out of control. Odysseus holds everything together. And so in his son, we can see echoes of this as Telemachus carefully meets people who are his own age, approaches these older individuals with a kind of excessive humility, playing to their ego, listening to them, while at the same time projecting sincerity and a kind of open-heartedness that is much appreciated by both Nestor and Menelaus, and Helen for that matter. So that is important. Now, we have to see that even though the text is kind of kind to him in this respect, in that he sort of successfully pulls off this diplomatic mission of sorts, and you can see perhaps this possibility for growth, his personal growth, we still find him to be unformed. And in part, this is because the text is telling us that despite all of this, he still needs his father, that he needs his dad, that this is a young man whose identity is unformed, whose self-esteem in particular, his pride, his sense of himself has not had the opportunity to develop, and in fact has been underdeveloped, has been stunted by the circumstances that he finds himself in. We see him kind of in the hallmark of, underdeveloped young men kind of fantasizing about revenge, right? And trying to curry favor with Athena, who actually will not grant him her full favor by accepting this gift that he tries to give her. We can see that he's unable to control his emotions, which are, revolve around himself feeling aggrieved or slighted. So he's characterized as brooding in the text and sullen, sulking, right? So these are emotions of a young man who hasn't learned how to be resilient yet, who still feels that everything is going against him and becomes caught up in the feeling that life is going against him. And it's true, he does face challenges, but the fact that he's unable to master his emotions, the text is telling us he still has a lot of growing to do. And there are clear elements or moments in which you can see a kind of overcompensation on the part of Telemachus. One of the most famous passages is where he declares to his mother that he is the master and insists that she goes back to her women's work, right? And says so very rudely and disparagingly to her. And regardless of the translation, it's clear that the text here is informing us that he is petulant that he is lashing out at his mother for his feeling of powerlessness, and that he's allowing these petty emotions to get the best of him. Now, there's elements of the story that verge on, and there are lots of echoes of these kinds of different stories in many ancient Greek myths, but there are elements in which we can see a kind of jealousy towards his mother creep in, right? Now, this is completely understandable. You have these predators, these young men occupying his home, who are kind of threatening to usurp his father's position, to share his mother's bed, and then to make him call them daddy, basically, right? So, this is a threat, but this kind of jealousy seeps over into an almost Oedipal moment that is important to pay attention to, because although Penelope as a character is very careful with what she says, she never encourages, unlike Helen, the audience to think that she is being sexually unfaithful, and yet the story does view her at times through the eyes of the suitors, who are definitely interested in her sexually, right? So she is a kind of sexual figure, both to her son and to the suitors to some extent, even while she herself remains very much under control, but and sort of unto herself, right? But the eye of the story follows her as she kind of wears this veil, right? Now remember, this is a very sexualized image, because Aphrodite wears a veil, right? And the veil comes into play in many other different stories as a kind of symbol for female sexuality and its sort of hidden nature, right? So when such a symbol is placed in the story, the audience would have known or would have sensed what that means, that this woman is seen in this way, right? So even though when she's sort of standing there on the staircase, seeing the suitors and calling to them to stop, have Phemius playing this, telling the story, and then she goes back upstairs and kind of weeps in her bed, right? But again, she's weeping in part because of the loss of Odysseus, right? Both his loss emotionally, his loss as a figure of strength and social authority, but also his loss as a lover, right? And so this again draws attention to some of the ways in which Telemachus, as a prince, as a male figure, is inadequate at the moment. He is indifferent and sort of unformed, unable to take on this kind of male role that is represented by the way that his mother feels, and the way that she still grieves so much for her husband, who's almost 20 years lost. So Telemachus has to undergo further humiliation, because there is a council of the Ithacans in which one of the main sort of evil suitors, and there are one or two who are a little bit more ambiguous in the way that they're portrayed, Antinous, who is a villain to his core, does this kind of classic bully move where he sort of pretends to befriend Telemachus and then mocks him openly, right? Right when Telemachus maybe thinks that there's some friendliness there, and this is famously one of the things that bullies do to publicly humiliate their victims, which is to offer them friendship and then suddenly reveal that this whole time they were mocking them and they were disgusted by them and found them to be shameful little worms, right? So this humiliates Telemachus further and places him in this position in the text, and we really start to feel as readers, as listeners to this story, that these suitors are that you cannot use diplomacy that you cannot persuade them to come around, to behave more reasonably, that there really is only one way to deal with them, right? That they have to be dealt with in one way. So you could think of the story as kind of bringing us along towards the fact that on the one hand, there's problems with this culture of honor, with problem solving through violence. On the other hand, maybe there are times in which it's necessary and justified. So again, we see that in Telemachus's case, Athena, talks about Odysseus as this incredibly powerful figure and holds out the promise to Telemachus that he will come of age, right? That he will undergo this rite of passage into manhood, but only if he can acquire his father's more forceful characteristics, his wisdom and his strength, which is a painful thing to experience, right? And yet Telemachus does kind of, make a decision. He kind of girds himself and he does kind of head out into the world on a mission, perhaps not as grand or as fascinating or as many splendored as his father's, but it is his own mission. And as readers, we kind of delight in this and look forward to their reunion. See you soon.